All right, so this is our last video on chapter 25 on early modern Africa. And in this video, we're going to look at the effects of the slave trade. And we're going to look at the effects of the slave trade on different areas. So the first place we're going to look at is the effects of the slave trade on Africa. Now, one thing we've got to pay attention to is that the effects here are not universal. The slave trade only affected about 100 miles inland from the west coast of Africa. Most other areas saw no or only indirect effects. So most slaves came from the west coast and about 100 miles inland from the west coast. Most other areas were more or less unaffected. Additionally, we're really only talking about young men being taken. So really only young men were taken. A few women. There were needs for women on plantations, mostly doing domestic work, but not a lot. So there were a few women taken, but mostly the people who were taken were young men. And because of that, we see some interesting social and political effects in Africa. So, because a lot of men were now missing from those societies, women took up traditional male roles. So we might see female soldiers, blacksmiths, leather workers, things that were traditionally male, women started to do because somebody needed to do those jobs and there weren't enough men to do them, so women did them. We also see a new practice of polygyny. Polygyny is where we see a man with more than one wife. One additional effect is that some African countries or some African governments began basing their entire economy on providing slaves. And an example of that is a place in West Africa called Dahomey. And what's especially ironic about these particular African governments is that they resisted the end of the slave trade harder than anyone. Like, that was their entire economy, and they were hurt almost the worst by the end of the slave trade than even the European colonial societies were. Okay, so moving on, taking a brief look at what was going on in Africa because of the slave trade. Another place that we need to pay attention to is on the Western Hemisphere. And here we're going to look at the African Diaspora. The African Diaspora, so a diaspora is a group of people forced out of their homeland and needing to settle somewhere else. Now, we've looked at a diaspora before. We've looked at the Hebrew or the Jewish diaspora. That was an example we've looked at previously. This is a new group, the African diaspora. And what we're going to notice is that people in the African diaspora are going to create syncretic cultural traditions. And there's two reasons for this. The first reason is simple. So one reason they do this is because they're kind of forced to adopt some European things. Like Christianity or European food, because that's what the Europeans are feeding them. But another reason why they create these syncretic cultural traditions, so here's another reason, is that the Africans are from all over Africa, or at least the part of Africa that was affected by the slave trade. They all have their own traditions, languages, and so they have to create something common to understand each other. And so what we're going to see, because of these two things, is the creation of what we'll call Creole traditions. Now, we've seen the word Creole before. Creoles were part of the Spanish colonial social hierarchy. And we're going to use this term again to denote something created in the Western Hemisphere. Because if you remember, Creoles in the Spanish social hierarchy were called, those people were European, but they were born in the Western Hemisphere. So we're going to create kind of a more general term to denote things that the Africans created in the Western Hemisphere. So they're going to take pieces of the Europeans, and they're going to take pieces from a variety of African societies and create something new. And we're going to call these things Creole things. So, for example, we might have Creole languages. So we might take European languages and mix in African words to create something new. And the best example of this might be Haitian Creole, which is kind of a mix of French and West African languages. We might also see some new religions. So we might think of voodoo or Santeria. So voodoo or Santeria are mixtures of African religions and Christianity. We could see the same thing if we look at music. So we're going to take things like African drumming and rhythms because African instruments weren't coming over, but you can really drum on anything and use African rhythms. And we're going to mix that with European instruments and, I guess, musical styles. And we're going to create new types of music. So we might consider from here things like African spirituals, which turn into gospel music. But we could also think about the creation of jazz and R&B, which would then turn into things like rock and roll. So the creation of modern music really has its roots in African drumming that was brought over in these forced journeys across the ocean. Now, what's interesting about the drumming, and I'll kind of just make this a little side note here, is that the plantation owners tried to outlaw the drumming because this was outlawed because it could be used as a signal. Like, you may not be able to understand each other, but if you hear a certain rhythm, you might know that that is the time to rebel or to sabotage something. So drumming was attempted to be outlawed. They tried to outlaw it, but you really can't stop people from drumming on things. It's kind of infeasible, so you can't really do that. We can even see it in terms of food. So we could create Creole food. So an example of this might be like adding African vegetables, for example, okra, to European soups to create something like gumbo. So we're going to take something African. We're going to take, like, I don't know, beef soup. We're going to add to it maybe some Western Hemisphere stuff like tomatoes or peppers or shrimp. And that's how we get gumbo. The last thing that I want to look at, and this will be something that we come back to when we get to time period 5, is the end of the slave trade. Why did the slave trade end? And what we'll notice is that there are lots of reasons. A lot of these reasons can be economic in nature. So, for one, and this should come as no surprise to anyone, slaves do not want to work hard. They will only work as hard as they need to avoid being punished. So slaves do not want to work hard. So this is inefficient and not a capitalist ideal. Right? Because if capitalism is about trying to make as much profit as you can efficiently, slavery does not meet that goal. There are also lots of examples of slave revolts. Revolts by themselves prevent money from being made. Because if they're revolting, they're not working. Revolts also require more security, which costs money. So, in effect, slavery was too expensive to continue. Because not only is it inefficient and unsafe, but you also have to provide food and shelter to the slaves, which also costs money. So what we'll find as a result of all of this is that it's actually cheaper to pay workers a salary and have them take care of themselves. So it's cheaper to pay workers a salary or pay them based on their work. So that's going to make them work more. And more efficiently. There were also, I guess we need to talk about the moral reasons, in that slavery is awful and not really Christian. And so we get a bunch of abolitionist societies that make these arguments. And those were persuasive, but they definitely weren't nearly as persuasive as the economic arguments. Because remember, we're thinking about making money. The economic arguments were more persuasive. But the moral reasons also played a part in that. So what we're going to see, and now we're kind of getting into beyond time period 4, but eventually what we'll see the Europeans turn to paying Africans to provide raw materials to Europe. That's one of the effects of this. And that actually has an added side benefit, because if you pay the Africans to provide raw materials to Europe, now the Africans can buy European stuff too. So let's look at some dates. And these are going to be after the end of time period 4, but just for the sake of our story here are some dates. In 1803, the Dutch and the British abolished the slave trade. Not slavery, but just the trading of slaves. And because they abolish it and enforce rules, the rest of Europe follows suit. It's not until later, so in 1833, the UK abolishes slavery, like slavery in general. The US does the same in 1865. In 1888, in Brazil. But if we want to go even further into the future, we don't see an abolition of slavery in Saudi Arabia until 1960. And one last point is that while slavery as we know it, as discussed here, is illegal, other forms of slavery persist. And we're still dealing with these things today. Things like debt bondage, like debt peonage. Basically, the hacienda system, which we talked about in chapter 24, that still exists. And human trafficking. These things still exist. They just operate under the radar. They're unofficial things, but they're still forms of slavery, and we're still dealing with them today. And we'll come back to this idea at the very end of our course when we talk about, well, now that we've reached the modern world and the present day, what things are we still dealing with? This is one of those things that we're still dealing with. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. And this is the end of our stuff on early modern Africa. So until the next time, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.